Hello and welcome back to Oh, I Didn't Know That, the show where curiosity takes the lead. I'm your host, Amber Hatfield. Hello and welcome back to the show. Last time on Oh, I Didn't Know That, in part 1, we spoke with researcher Laura Bonsaver about how Taiwanese teenagers are engaging with Chinese content online. Laura's curiosity began when she noticed a generational divide. Many young people in Taiwan were using Chinese slang, picked up on platforms like TikTok and RedNote, and some older generations were uneasy about it. Drawing from her background in international relations and communications, Laura launched a research project surveying young people aged 13 to 33. She found that while younger teens are exposed to more positive content and use Chinese slang more frequently, older respondents tended to be more sceptical and concerned about potential influence. Interestingly, many teens expressed their awareness of misinformation online, though their reactions range from apathy to anxiety. This raises some questions about cultural exchange, identity, and whether digital habits might subtly influence perceptions of China. Today we continue and also discuss how platforms like TikTok and RedNote might serve as tools of soft power and what that could mean for youth in Taiwan. I wanted to talk a little bit about the use of things like TikTok or RedNote as kind of a soft power tool from China, maybe. Yeah. Because I also read an article the other day talking about TikTok influencers having things like all expenses paid trips to China and maybe using things like travel to mask these deeper political objectives of China. Is that something that you've also looked at? Soft power is the idea of influencing others not through force but through attraction, using things like culture, media and communication to shape preferences. And in recent years, Chinese apps like TikTok, known as Douyin in China, and RedNote, or Xiaohongshu, have become wildly popular among Taiwanese youth, and youth across the world. But their appeal also raises questions about influence and intention.
Well, I think from the beginning, the context was really important. So just as you say, the fact that there is a lot of research coming out on that, there's Taiwanese influencers that have come out kind of admitting to being offered payment from the government to go travel to China, as you say, and kind of promote it as a place to live, to kind of create content. So there is a lot of background about that. There is people doing it, people are being paid. In general, TikTok, Douyin is owned by China, RedNote as well, like they are all kind of Chinese based, and I think it's worth knowing that and worth being kind of vigilant on the fact that what you see online could be coming from a different source or not true. I looked at that as a background, and that's very important to why I'm doing my research. But my research is focused really on the impact. So wherever the content is coming from, how is the impact? How does that impact the way that they view China?
Content is not always overtly political, and in fact, much of it is lighthearted, featuring food, fashion, pets, or travel. And when that content repeatedly presents a certain lifestyle or environment, it can gradually shape perceptions, even without viewers realising it.
Because some of the content won't be disinformation. A lot of content that people see from China, which came out in the survey, is quite lighthearted. You know, it's lots of street markets, cultural, like living with pets, how to cook. There's a lot of very lighthearted content as well. And some of that could be, there could be kind of hidden messages within that. But I think it's really important to know that a lot of the content could also not be disinformation, and it still could impact the way that they see things. Because if China is, the way that it's kind of expanding its role globally, it is having a higher impact in general, even for, European audiences. It's like there are more Chinese accounts appearing. And so it is a kind of broader influence that could be a byproduct of just the way that it has expanded. So I think I'm just looking at how do they perceive it? What do they see? With the background of the fact that some could be disinformation and that knowledge, and I'm trying to understand what do teenagers think of that content.
And so in your article, you kind of talked about how you're not saying necessarily that teens are becoming pro-China, but that it's kind of these subtle shifts in perception or kind of these subtle changes. At what point do you think that those kind of shifts would then maybe begin to influence political attitudes of young people?
Yeah, I think there's a really big shift that's necessary, which is why we're monitoring tiny shifts at this point, and why I think that it's still important to monitor tiny shifts just in case they become larger shifts. But at this point, it's a really big shift because, first of all, question of Taiwanese identity, absolutely not in question at the moment. Like, there have been so many surveys taken after the last few years. A great majority still of Taiwanese people don't question their sense of identity. That's really important as well, because my research isn't about how Taiwanese do feel. That's a question that's kind of been put to bed at the moment. We know that that's not something that's going to be moved anytime soon. Political opinions towards China as well they don't change massively, and there hasn't been any kind of proof yet of anything changing, of more young people becoming more pro-China. So yeah, I think big political opinions, that takes a lot to change. But I think soft power is a very slow, long process. And with teenagers are kind of engaging with content and kind of they're growing up in a world where they might feel kind of, I guess, not as strongly negative opinions, because I think what came out of the survey was the older people had harder, stronger negative opinions on things. And if that is slightly less negative, yes, they might still feel not necessarily pro-China, but that is still kind of an evolution in itself that's leading somewhere. I also think that more communication and more interaction between Taiwanese and Chinese teenagers shouldn't be seen just as a bad thing. We shouldn't see this as like a negative phenomenon, necessarily, because that's not a bad thing that they should be engaging with each other. And there's more cultural understanding between the two sides that can actually lead to more dialogue. So that connection or increasing connection isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it doesn't have to be seen necessarily within a political lens. But there is the political background to these relations, and as a result, I think it's still worth looking at.
Laura's research included a recent survey of over 100 young people across Taiwan, and she looked at not only age differences but also other variables, like whether someone had family in China or had visited the country. Yeah, so you are going to continue researching this topic, right? And you mentioned before that you've got some more data now than you did before.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that and what else it is that you're looking at?
Yeah, so that's the kind of recent survey that I expanded into, and that was a really interesting one because we were looking at the content that they were looking at, the opinions on China, whether they see China as a appealing place to live, their opinions on kind of social media more broadly. And that's been a really interesting one for kind of understanding also that there are different factors involved, that it's not just age that necessarily defines you for how your opinions are going to be on China. I asked a few more questions based on other factors as well to kind of see if there were any other influences. And what came out was that if a young person had family or friend more links to China, then they were more likely to have positive opinions towards China. If they had been to China as well and kind of experienced living there as well, they were also more likely to have a positive impression of China. So there were other factors involved as well, and I think it is important to discuss that it isn't just age necessarily that's influencing people, but other contexts as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it was discussing about the exchange that kind of went on when TikTok was about to go down in the US. And then everybody got onto Red Note, and there was this big exchange of opinions between Chinese people and US people in the US, and kind of finding things out about each other and understanding things about each other that they didn't before. So I guess, it doesn't have to just necessarily be a bad thing, that there's more communication between two groups of people.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that example, actually, because I was doing my research during that time, and that was a time in which I thought, is that going to happen in Taiwan, or is it going to affect the way that people engage with social media here? But I equally, in like a very similar way, found that moment very interesting, because it was this idea of suddenly all these people having access to these conversations and these exchanges. There's a lot of positivity that came out of it, a lot of people talking about how they felt kind of more knowledgeable or able to exchange across these countries where often you don't have that opportunity. So I thought that was a really interesting phenomenon, and really made me think as well about that whole idea that when we live in different countries, also with different levels of political control as well, different access to apps. In China, there's a lot of applications that people can't access. So having that shared platform is actually also very, very special place to have those conversations that might be difficult sometimes, but also might challenge people to kind of think and consider the other perspective.
Yeah. Do you have any insight on how many people in Taiwan use Red Note?
It's a really high number of Red Note and TikTok. I haven't got the number in front of me, but it is a really high amount. A lot of people see TikTok as like their main source of information as well.
Right,
it's not just that a large amount of Taiwanese teenagers are using TikTok. That is where they're sourcing their main information.
According to a Ministry of Digital Affairs report on 2024 usage of the platform TikTok or Douyin, over 1/5 of Taiwan's adult population used the platform at least once during a 3-month period in 2024. And according to the 2024 independent annual survey, the Taiwan Internet Report, around 22% of Taiwanese are TikTok users, with as many as 44% of elementary school students and 60% of junior high school students using the app.
And a majority of them are using it for like between 2 to 5 hours a day, which is a lot of time.
And so what do you think might be some of maybe the long-term implications of this kind of influence or cultural influence from China on younger generations in Taiwan? Do you have any thoughts about what you think that might be?
Yeah, I think it can go a number of ways. I think it would be impossible for me to be able to sit here and say that I think relations will get better or get worse, that I think that everyone's going to make friends or everyone's going to distrust each other even more because of all the fake information. So I don't think that I could say exactly what will happen. I would love to think that this exchange is a positive thing, that there's more understanding between the two. I think there's such silos of information between Taiwan and China and the rest of the world. And I would love to think that it's a positive thing, that more young people are engaging with each other. At the same time, I think that, you know, a lot of Taiwanese people still feel very resolute in their opinions and their political opinions. Of course, their sense of Taiwanese identity, but also the way that they see China. For as long as Taiwan and China and the kind of cross-strait relations are as tense as they are, I'm not kind of expecting there to be a sudden lift in opinions of positivity, because those young people, they might be engaging with people online, but they're also talking to their friends of different generations, of different ages. They're also growing up with different education, different media as well, you know, the different information that they're getting from the news, from their teachers. So I'm not expecting there to be a big change in opinion anytime soon, but I still think it's an important thing to monitor.
And so what would you kind of hope that readers of your articles or people who see your research would maybe take away from this research that you're doing about this issue?
I think my research, I'd like it to be a reminder of how much opinions can vary amongst young people. There's so much research that generalises youth, and I do think the world is changing much quicker than it was before, especially because of, you know, digital developments. I think subgenerational divides are potentially much bigger than they were a few decades ago. And I think it's an important reminder to really divide up young people, because someone at the age of 15, growing up in this world, not only in Taiwan, is growing up in a very different world to someone of 35 years old. So a reminder to check and investigate differences in perceptions over youth when doing research, and also more kind of data and information that can be going towards understanding how young people are feeling towards China. I think also generally on media literacy as well, and concerns over fake news. I think governments do need to be reminded of how much young people are faced with a lot of fake information and aren't quite sure where to go about it and how to understand what's real. And I think if this can also influence more kind of funding and efforts with, public organisations, private and also governments to mobilise a little more to try and find solutions to this.
Media literacy is becoming more important than ever, not just for young people, but for everyone. And understanding where content comes from, who's behind it, and how it might shape our thinking is really critical in a world where misinformation spreads fast and influence can be subtle.
We live in a free society. We're not going to block necessarily information, and it's very hard to know where to block it from. But it is a new reality that we're dealing with. And there's a lot of young people that aren't really knowing how to deal with that, that need kind of more support.
Yeah. Even myself, I find when I'm online, I mean, we've been online probably now for 10, 15 years as adults that we are. And I find myself looking at things and wondering where they're coming from and what the sources of this information is, and how to know whether or not it's correct or not. I think it's something that everyone faces, not just young people.
Well, exactly, because then you've also got the older generations, which it can be even more susceptible to influence because they're kind of even less knowledgeable potentially on the origins. So there's even programs in Taiwan that help older generations of Taiwanese people who are also seeing things online and aren't sure what's real. But yeah, I think what you said about that knowledge of knowing, of not being sure, I think it's a funny one because we see information and we know that it's not 100% true, but we still can be influenced. We all know what it's like to know that reality on social media isn't true. Yet when we see loads of our friends on holiday and having an amazing time, our brains can be tricked so easily. We know that not everyone is having a great time and it's not you having a terrible time while everyone's out having fun. Yet our brains still feel that emotional impact of seeing information constantly every day that is sometimes kind of skewed or there for a different purpose. And it amazes me how easily tricked we are, even when we are kind of armed with the tools of understanding that things are true and things aren't. So yeah, there are some really important things about my research that are really important to underline, which is, you know, that this isn't about Taiwanese identity, that this isn't an assumption that everything coming from China is disinformation or that it should be viewed negatively, or that exchange between teenagers in China and Taiwan should be viewed negatively. Those are the kind of important things for my research because it is a sensitive subject, and especially for audiences in Taiwan and outside. We're talking about perceptions and sensitive kind of political opinions, and I think it is important to say that. And also that it's always an open question, and that, as we say, language can evolve, perceptions can change, and that can have different results.
Yeah, I think that is important to say because while learning from people and learning from people's research, people's expertise, to also know that nobody knows the future and nobody can really tell exactly what's going to happen. So you should try to keep things open. Absolutely. As well.
In this, especially with international relations, there is so much alarmist language happening because that's what sells. You know, like journalists love to say, oh, this is happening, and so that people can read it. And I think that's really important for me not to have too much of that stance just so that people look at my research to try and tell people that there's this crazy phenomenon happening and it's necessarily a negative thing or necessarily has to mean anything. I think that's really important, not to be alarmist in this world, to look at data, to consider changes. If there's anything to be concerned about, to act upon that, but also not to kind of raise alarm or raise concern where it doesn't necessarily need to be raised. And stay curious as well. I think stay curious that people's opinions can change, and to keep asking questions. Like this research started because I was talking to colleagues, and it's just that kind of curiosity can be incited because you're hearing people say opinions and this is something you hadn't thought about before and what a lot of other people that you talk to haven't thought about before. So it's kind of looking more into that and seeing if anything comes out of it.
Thanks very much to Laura Bonsaver for sharing her research and also her insight into how Taiwanese teenagers are engaging with Chinese content online. That's all for this week's episode of Oh, I Didn't Know That. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join me here again next week.